Have you ever noticed that those black people who think in ways that are most beneficial to the white society and in ways that are against their own interests tend to usually consider themselves as being the smartest ones in the room? These are those black people who constantly chastises the black community and insist that we're our own worst enemies and thinks that we should respect, revere, and try to be more like Caucasians in spite of a brutally horrific history of the contrary. But what if I told you that those black people who think those things actually possesses the weakest mental fortitudes and are therefore the most mentally enslaved among us? It's always a form of mental enslavement whenever the oppressed thinks in ways that are beneficial to their oppressors and against themselves. Here's the absolute truth of how this was done to black people. In response to the unprecedented unified black protests of the 1960s, white social scientists determined in 1968 that unless the oppressed and the oppressors are operating within a shared value system, they cannot coexist peacefully. It was therefore decided that decade's unprecedented unified black protests against the white oppressed society could be subdued by ingraining a value system within the collective subconscious minds of black people that serves and protects the system of white supremacy. They achieved this feat by deploying an ideological subversion system against the black population. Ideological subversion is an offensive psychological warfare tactic that uses disinformation, misinformation, and unrelenting propaganda campaigns to change a targeted population in ways that are against their own self-interest and instead in ways serving those that are deploying the ideological subversion system. Here are the details. In 1968, in response to that decade's unprecedented unified black protests, white social scientists were hired to thoroughly study the African American population and then give recommendations for how the problem could be addressed. Their mission was to find our greatest strength and then attack it unrelentingly, and to find our most exploitable weakness and then exploit it unrelentingly. They determined that our greatest strength was black unity. They now attacks it unrelentingly with their propaganda campaigns exaggerating the issue of black on black crime. It's also being done through their crime reenactment TV shows that overrepresents black on black crimes. Those propaganda campaigns have profoundly divided our ranks and have shifted black collective regressions away from the white oppressive society and redirected it against ourselves. It's the true reason why millions of black people now insist that it is we that are now our worst enemies. It's also the true reason why we are now more divided than at any previous time in history. They determined that our most exploitable weakness was the fact that we were stripped of our true identity and culture during slavery. This makes us more susceptible to negative media social engineering. They exploited this fact to negatively steer our culture through negative media social engineering. This is all possible because a group's identity is shaped by how they repeatedly see themselves depicted within the media. People often become those derogatory media depictions of themselves that they've accepted as being their reality. Therefore, those who controls the people's media images controls their culture. Because white oppressive forces controls black people's media images, they negatively distort our media images in order to covertly negatively steer our culture. It's the true reason why millions of us now self-identify by the N-word, call our women by the B-word, sags our pants, and glorifies pimps. Furthermore, white social scientists also determined that an aggravating core factor for the 1960s unprecedented unified black protest was also an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of the Black Pride movement. They therefore logically determined that they could also subdue unified black protests by keeping our collective self-esteems very low. They achieved this feat by keeping us believing the fraudulent and worst narratives about ourselves. And it's so obvious that they're doing this that it's only by not critically thinking that it cannot be seen. Because when you start critically thinking, it then becomes easy to see just how cartoonishly unrealistic it actually is. That virtually all information that we receive about ourselves from the white society are consistently negative and black racially demoralizing and black racially devaluing. It's fraudulent propaganda designed to keep our collective self-esteems very low. Because these changes were gradually made to the African American culture, most have normalized these changes. But there's nothing normal about any of these changes. These profound changes within the African American culture that clearly benefit the system of white supremacy are by deliberate design. They are the results of an insidious ideological subversion system deployed by white oppressive forces. And as I've stated earlier, ideological subversion is an offensive psychological warfare tactic that uses disinformation and misinformation as weapons to manipulate targeted populations to think and behave in ways that are against their own self-interest. The purpose is to attack the targeted population at a psychological level in a bid to destabilize and undermine their entire culture and ideological structure. To restate that in layman's terms, the goal is to spread so much disinformation into the black community until virtually everything believed by the black community are falsehoods that are designed to hinder our ability to liberate ourselves. It confuses the black population to such an extent that in spite of abundance of information, no one is able to come to any sensible conclusions in the interest of defending our communities and liberating ourselves. This is the truth of our plight and condition. The ultimate goal is the complete collapse of the black population. In addition to this ideological subversion system, white oppressive forces has also trauma bonded black people. Trauma bond, usually the term trauma bond refers to a gaslighting mental abuse that occurs within an abusive relationship, wherein which one partner is manipulated and mentally abused by the narcissistic partner. Within that scenario, after repeatedly brutalizing the victim, the narcissistic abusive partner never acknowledges any of his wrongdoing. He instead minimizes the abuse and tells his victim that the abuse wasn't that bad and to just shut up and get over it. He then constantly inundates the victims with demoralizing, disapproving narratives about the victim. This is continued until the victim stops focusing on the abuse and instead focus only on the demoralizing, disapproving narratives. This focus causes the abused victims to, rather than resenting the abuser, they instead try to win the approval of the abuser. This trauma bonding effect provides the abuser with a more favorable outcome from the victim rather than having the victims hating and resenting them. The human mind is easy to manipulate when the victim is unaware of what's being done to their minds. It's a well-proven gaslighting tactic. Likewise, the same trauma bonding abusive manipulation tactic is what white social engineering scientists and white propagandists have deployed against the black population. After brutalizing black people for many centuries, the white society never acknowledged any of their horrible wrongdoings. They instead insist that the abuse against black people wasn't that bad, and they tell us to just get over it. Shut up and get over it. They then constantly inundates the black population with black racially demoralizing and white disapproving narratives about ourselves. Therefore, rather than resenting the white society for their brutal mistreatment of us, many of us instead tries to win their approval. Many black people will go out of their way to try to show white people that we're not all bad. Black people are within an abusive relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like within most abusive relationship, they've convinced many black people to believe that their mistreatments of us throughout history was our own fault. It's a psychological mind hack. The minds of targeted populations are quite easy to manipulate if they're unaware of what's being done to them. Once minds have been confused, manipulation becomes simple. The mind will even ignore common sense, and rationality falls away, even overlooking hypocrisy and deception. Now you know the truth of our plighted condition. Throughout generations, the ancestors have always provided us with those they have given insight to lead us out of the maze of confusion which our enemies have designed for us. Those of us that are blessed with this gift of spiritual insight must teach the truth to those who do not know the truth. Our ancestors demand this of us. Those who know must teach. One love and peace, brothers and sisters. We must function based on what is true.